The year is 1419, and the Kingdom of France lies shattered. In the north, the English King Henry V ruthlessly subjugates Normandy, while the rest of the realm bleeds from the savage feud between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Their desperate attempt at reconciliation ends in treachery at Montereau, where the Burgundian Duke Jean the Fearless falls to Armagnac blades, opening France to English ambitions. The next 3 years will be marked by Henry's greatest political triumph, only to culminate in the most grueling and ruinous experience of his life, the Siege of Meaux. On September 14, 1419, Philip the Good, the Burgundian heir apparent, received news that his father, Jean the Fearless, had been assassinated on the Montereau bridge. Upon hearing of the Armagnac's treachery, the prince flung himself onto his bed, thrashing about, grinding his teeth, and rolling his eyes. Only one thought consumed his mind: revenge. Any hope for reconciliation between the Armagnacs and Burgundians had now vanished, as both sides were determined to annihilate each other to the last man. Mere days after Jean the Fearless's death, Burgundian diplomats opened negotiations with the English. Henry V received assurances that virtually all his demands would be met. The Burgundians, in turn, could count on English support to defeat the Armagnacs. On May 21, 1420, the text of the treaty that would shape French politics for decades to come was solemnly read out in Troyes Cathedral. At its core was the rearrangement of dynastic ties between the Valois and Plantagenets. Henry V would marry Catherine, daughter of the French king. Charles VI would recognize Henry V as his adopted son, and Henry would honor Charles as his father. While Charles lived, Henry would be his regent, officially titled King of England and heir to France. And upon Charles VI's death, the French crown would pass to Henry and his descendants. In essence, the Treaty of Troyes established a dynastic union between England and France, where the two crowns would unite under Henry V following Charles' passing. Later, this political arrangement would come to be known as dual monarchy. Despite sharing a common ruler, both England and France were to maintain their independence, with separate institutions, laws, and customs. The lands Henry had conquered within and beyond the Duchy of Normandy were to remain his absolutely, governed separately from the rest of France. The Treaty of Troyes was presented to the English and French populations as a final, eternal peace, destined to end mutual enmity and centuries-old hatred. Separate provisions were dedicated to Charles the Dauphin. The document effectively disinherited him, though this was nowhere stated explicitly. One clause prohibited any party from conducting independent negotiations with Charles due to the frightful and astounding crimes he had committed. Another bound Henry to reclaim all lands within the kingdom belonging to the party commonly called that of the Dauphin and the Armagnac. This was the treaty's fatal flaw. According to British historian Juliet Barker, the Treaty of Troyes was not really a final peace, but a commitment to continue the war. By this time, the Dauphin had already established an alternative government in Poitiers, effectively ruling over all France south of the Loire River, as well as parts of the Upper Seine and Yonne. The population of these territories firmly rejected the Treaty of Troyes. If Henry was to bring eternal peace to France, it would only be at the point of a sword. After signing the Treaty of Troyes, the new regent of France began his conquest of Armagnac fortresses south of Paris. On June 24th, combined Anglo-Burgundian forces stormed Montereau, where Jean the Fearless had recently met his end. His remains, having lain in the grave for 10 months, were solemnly exhumed and sent to Dijon for reburial. The next fortress standing in the path of the Anglo-Burgundian army was Moulins, defended by 700 Dauphinists. After enduring a siege lasting over 3 months, the garrison finally opened the gates on November 18th. On Henry's order, a number of Armagnacs and 24 Scottish mercenaries were executed. On December 1st, Henry made his first formal entry into Paris, riding beside his young wife, the Duke of Burgundy, and his brothers. The Allies' arrival in the capital was met with widespread celebrations, though Henry himself showed little interest. He had come to Paris to complete the formal procedures related to the Treaty of Troyes, to secure ratification of the document by the Estates General, and to conduct a trial of Jean the Fearless's murderers. Since the estates now consisted entirely of Burgundians, the treaty was easily ratified. Hearings on the Montereau murder began 2 weeks later. The Dauphin was summoned to Paris to personally answer the charges. As expected, Charles did not appear and was consequently found guilty of Jean the Fearless's murder. The Royal Council and the Parliament of Paris expelled the Dauphin from the country and declared him unworthy to wear the crown. Charles was now officially disinherited. Henry did not linger in Paris, as pressing matters awaited him in the north. The king needed funds to continue his campaigns. Recognizing that England was running out of resources, he now planned to extract money from the recently conquered territories. Upon arriving in Rouen, Henry presided over an assembly of the Norman estates. By this time, the occupation had inflicted serious damage on the duchy's economy, with agriculture, trade, and crafts all suffering, and little hope for recovery despite Henry's administrative efforts. Nevertheless, the Normans were informed of a new ruinous tax of £100,000, with the initial payment due within months. This heavy taxation shattered any remaining illusions the Normans held about their new monarch. The Norman poet Robert Blondel, expressing public sentiment, described Henry as the ferocious and savage king, as a tyrant, as cruel. On February 1st, Henry and Catherine landed in Dover. Throughout England, Henry was hailed as a national hero. However, it soon became clear that this popular jubilation masked deep war weariness. The Treasury's yearly revenue had dwindled to £57,000, barely enough to cover soldiers' wages and nothing else. Funds no longer sufficed for artillery maintenance, diplomatic needs, or upkeep of the royal court, forcing Henry to borrow an additional £36,000. Eventually, Henry embarked on a tour of the country, officially to show the Queen her new realm, but in reality to collect money. Special commissioners followed the royal procession, tasked with extracting subsidies by any means necessary, from nobility and landowners, clergy and towns, yeomen and craftsmen. As the Welsh chronicler Adam of Usk described this journey, Henry was rending of every man throughout the realm, be he rich or poor. Despite their deep reverence for the king, the English grew increasingly anxious about his overseas ambitions. At Lincoln, Henry received tragic news from France. His brother and designated heir, Thomas Clarence, whom the king had left in command during his absence, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Beaujeu. The sole consolation was that Thomas Montagu, Earl of Salisbury, a skilled and level-headed captain, had regrouped the remaining troops and conducted an orderly retreat to the safety of Normandy. Henry urgently needed to return to France, for the third and final time in his life. Henry arrived in Calais in June 1421, leading an army of 900 men-at-arms and 3,300 archers, a far cry from his forces in Agincourt. Assured that Normandy was in safe hands, Henry swiftly traveled to the ever-rebellious Paris and restored order there. Now the king could fully devote himself to the struggle against the Dauphin. After the victory at Bougé, Charles had laid siege to Chartres. However, when the English king assembled his troops on the Seine and advanced to support the city, the Dauphin hastily abandoned the siege and withdrew across the Loire. Henry spent August and September clearing Armagnac garrisons from the regions around Paris, particularly to the east and south. Dreux surrendered on August 20th, followed by Beaugency on September 8th. In the latter half of September, the English captured Nemours and Rougemont. Enraged that a single English soldier died during the assault on Rougemont, Henry ordered the town set ablaze and its garrison drowned. And when questioned about his ruthless destruction and burning of towns, Henry replied, "War without fire is like sausages without mustard." A shortage of supplies and dysentery, the scourge of medieval armies, brought an end to the campaign of 1421. However, Henry was determined to use his soldiers as effectively as possible before their military contracts expired. The people of Paris had long been pleading with him to capture the town of Meaux, whose Armagnac garrison frequently raided the capital's outskirts, targeting travelers, disrupting commerce, and destroying food stocks. Meaux lay on the north bank of the Marne River, about 50 kilometers from Paris. The town's defenses were unremarkable, consisting of ancient walls dating back to the Roman times. Meaux's true strength, however, came from an immense fortified suburb on the opposite bank of the river known as the Marché, or Market, connected to the town by a long stone bridge. The market occupied a tight bend in the Marne, which curved around its walls on 3 sides. The fourth, southern side, was protected by a canal dug across the peninsula. The garrison, numbering about 1,000 soldiers, consisted of outlaws and deserters, transformed into a formidable fighting force by skilled Armagnac captains. One of them, known as the Bastard of Varus, whose true name remains a mystery, was notorious for his brutality and ruthlessness. Outside the town stood an elm tree called the Varus tree, on which the Gascon hanged his victims. In 1421, 80 corpses were already dangling from its branches. The English vanguard arrived at the town without warning, seizing the northern suburbs before the defenders could destroy them. The rest of the English army appeared about 3 weeks later. Surprisingly, the besieging force was small, numbering no more than 2,000 men, with half of them being miners, craftsmen, and military servants. The merciless king began the steady, methodical subjugation of the town. English soldiers dug ditches and built fences around their camps. They constructed a wooden pontoon bridge over the Marne to halt river traffic and secure a line of communication. They set up food markets supplied by a procession of river barges from Champagne. Numerous bombards and trebuchets were positioned around the walls. The Burgundian chronicler Jean Lefebvre came to look. "It was an impressive thing to see," he later recorded. Autumn slowly yielded to winter, but the siege, despite the besiegers' best efforts, seemed to make no progress at all. The defenders swiftly repaired damage caused by artillery bombardment. Anyone daring to approach the walls met fierce fire from wall-mounted cannons. Once, the Armagnacs brought a donkey dressed in a jester's crown onto the wall and, in full view of the English, started beating it with a stick. The spectacle was accompanied by laughter and loud cries. "Hey, Brits! Why aren't you rescuing your king?" In addition to the defenders' efforts, the English were further hampered by harsh weather conditions. Throughout December, it rained incessantly. Eventually, the Marne overflowed its banks, flooding the plain where the English camp stood, forcing the besiegers to move inland. The English, already suffering significant combat casualties, now began losing soldiers to dysentery and desertion. Payrolls indicate that by Christmas, the king had lost 1/6 of his army. By the end of 1421, Henry's already depleted resources were severely overextended. At this time, roughly 8,000 English soldiers were stationed in France, 7,000 in Normandy, and 1,000 in Paris and its suburbs, most on garrison duty. Uniting them was nearly impossible, as it would have left many fortresses and towns undefended. Henry's only available field army was the expeditionary corps that had landed with him in Calais, now reduced to a mere 1,700 men. Some researchers believe that by 1422, Henry had completely exhausted his military options. Looking ahead, it was difficult to see, writes British historian Jonathan Sumption, where either the men or the money would be found to conduct offensive operations in the north, let alone conquer the kingdom of Bourges. Meanwhile, March 1422 arrived, yet Meaux, besieged for 5 months, was still holding out. The only attempt to relieve the garrison was a daring enterprise by Guy de Nesle, Lord of Offemont. On the night of March 9th, he and 40 men-at-arms crept through the sleeping English and reached a designated spot in front of the fortifications. There they found a camouflaged ladder. Some men managed to climb the wall, but Guy himself lost his footing and plunged into the water-filled moat. The commander grabbed onto 2 extended pikes, but clad in full plate armor, he was too heavy to be pulled out. Eventually, his splashing alerted English sentries, who swiftly arrived at the moat and took the Lord of Offemont prisoner. It's hard to say what Offemont might have achieved had he entered the town. By then, Meaux's residents had become demoralized and planned to surrender to save their lives and what remained of their town. Recognizing that their defense options were almost exhausted, the garrison decided to retreat to the market and make their stand there. The next morning, defenders were seen abandoning their posts on the walls and moving possessions across the bridge to the fortress. A rumor spread through the streets that the Armagnacs would torch the houses before leaving, and one of the residents shouted to the English what was happening. The king ordered an immediate general assault. Anticipating such a command, a Savoyard captain had already led his men forward, set up ladders, and captured an undefended section of the wall. The gates swung open, and the English poured in, pursuing the retreating Armagnacs. However, the defenders managed to cross the Marne and raise the bridge behind them. In the following days, the Dauphinists watched from the market's high walls as the English positioned artillery on the Marne's islands and took over the watermills that just a week earlier had been grinding grain for the garrison. The siege of the market of Meaux dragged on for another 2 months. The English assaulted the fortifications with utter disregard for casualties, revealing Henry's resolve to end the siege at any cost. Artillerymen fired at the walls from bombards at close range. The Earl of Warwick's detachment crossed the canal and, sheltered by a mobile wooden shield, secured a position on a narrow strip between the walls and the water's edge. Sir Walter Hungerford, commanding the western sector, bridged the river and seized another foothold, from where his men began tunneling a mine under the fortress. On the eastern side, Henry's engineers constructed a siege tower on 2 large barges. From this structure, which loomed above the walls, a bridge could be lowered onto the ramparts. All these operations were conducted under a barrage of crossbow bolts and deadly artillery fire. The English suffered heavy losses, especially among their captains. On May 10th, after 7 months of stubborn resistance, Meaux finally capitulated. Henry showed no mercy. 4 leaders of the defense, including the bastard of Varus, were executed immediately. The French artillerymen responsible for the deaths of English nobles were also sent to the gallows. Several hundred prisoners were dispersed among the prisons of England, Normandy, and Wales. Mentally and physically exhausted from the prolonged siege, Henry V departed for Paris, where he pompously celebrated the birth of his heir. The English king could take pride in successfully concluding his third French campaign. The Duke of Clarence's death was avenged, and the Dauphinists were driven from Paris. The main consequence of Meaux's capture was that Jean, Duke of Brittany, switched allegiance to support the English. In late June, he sent a delegation to Paris and pledged to appear before the king at the earliest opportunity. The sad irony was that much of this had already become irrelevant. Despite the difficulties of military campaigns, Henry V was always known for his robust health. However, in February, amidst the siege of Meaux, he fell ill, and a physician was summoned to him from England. In June, when the Dauphinists besieged the Burgundian fortress of Caen, Henry moved to assist his ally. Yet the king's illness grew so severe during the campaign that he had no choice but to abandon the army and was carried in a litter to Vincennes, a suburb of Paris. A few days later, a messenger caught up with the Duke of Bedford, who was passing through Troyes with the English army, bearing news that the king was on his deathbed. Henry made preparations for his death with characteristic composure. The king had never seen his 8-month-old son, and now his top priority was to protect his heir and the weighty legacy that awaited him. On August 26th, the king verbally delivered his political testament. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, was to remain the young Henry's guardian until he came of age. The Duke of Bedford, the most talented of his brothers, was charged with continuing Henry's work in France. Bedford was to become the guardian of Normandy, as well as the regent of France, should the Duke of Burgundy decline this title. Regarding the struggle against the Dauphin, Henry instructed Bedford to continue the war until all of France recognized the Treaty of Troyes. At all costs, John was to maintain the alliance with Burgundy, on which the English position on the continent critically depended. Until the heir came of age, the Duke of Orleans and other prisoners of Agincourt were to remain in captivity as hostages. This was an uncompromising message. Nevertheless, even in his final hours, Henry recognized that a negotiated settlement might become England's only way out. He told Bedford that if a treaty with the Dauphin became necessary, Normandy must remain under English control. At 2 o'clock in the morning on August 31st, 1422, Henry V died. He was 36 years old. To his subjects, Henry embodied the true knight of the late Middle Ages. Brave, self-assured, composed in difficult situations, capable of inspiring others. Even the French acknowledged his merits, not only as a military leader but also as a man of justice. By this, they meant that Henry was a rigorous disciplinarian. He made himself feared, a quality that medieval subjects expected from their king. No ruler of his time, wrote the official historiographer of Charles the Dauphin, future Charles VII, was more obviously fitted by his talents and his wisdom to conquer and occupy another country. Henry united his countrymen, conquered Normandy, established control over the central institutions of the French state. By the standards of the era, these were outstanding achievements, yet they proved fragile. Henry's ambitions relied too heavily on the meager resources of the English kingdom. His conquests owed too much to the extraordinary circumstances in France during his reign: the king's madness, 15 years of civil war, the assassination of Jean the Fearless, and the political and military miscalculations of the Dauphinists. They also owed to Henry's personal qualities: his ominous reputation, military talent, iron will, and boundless energy. No one expected Charles VI, frail in health and prematurely aged at 54, to outlive his vigorous son-in-law. The King of France died on October 21st, just 7 weeks after Henry. His funeral preparations dragged on for nearly a month. Purges among courtiers and general instability meant that no one could simply recall the protocol. Finally, the funeral was held from November 9th to 11th, following a ceremony that bore a distinctly English imprint. The funeral's grandeur could hardly compensate for its somber atmosphere. Many mourners must have felt they were witnessing not just the king's funeral, but that of the French monarchy itself. Not a single prince of royal blood was present to accompany the king's coffin. His widow refused to participate, secluding herself in the Hôtel Saint-Paul. His only surviving son, disinherited, was in the south, leading a rebellious kingdom. His younger daughter, the widow of his country's sworn enemy, was in England, while his eldest daughter, the wife of England's new ally, was in Brittany. The Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon languished in English captivity. The Duke of Burgundy had left Paris, sending only a letter of apology. Traditionally, the heir of the deceased king followed his coffin. This time, there was no heir. The semblance of tradition was maintained by a lone figure in a black cape, following the coffin at some distance from the other mourners. It was the new regent of France, John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford. May our good, gracious Lord have mercy on the soul of the last mighty and splendid King, Charles VI of France, our liege lord. The Barry King of Arms proclaimed loudly, "May our Lord grant long life to Henry, by the grace of God, King of England and France, our new liege lord." Ironically, the crowns of the two kingdoms that had been feuding for over 80 years were now united in a 1-year-old infant. There was no end in sight for the 100 Years' War. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, help others discover it too. Hit the like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for the upcoming episodes. Until next time.